The Halo universe is filled with religious themes and imagery, amongst them the most obvious being John 1:17, aka the Master Chief. There's many things he represents in the overarching biblical themes within Halo, but he most certainly represents Jesus. But as we'll be looking today, he represents yet another aspect of the Bible. For a quick rundown, the major factions within Halo can be broken down into the four horsemen of the biblical apocalypse. First, let's talk about what is the apocalypse. The literal definition of the apocalypse is the destruction of the world. But in the modern era, the apocalypse more often refers to a drastic change in the status quo, such as the end of the world as we know it. Think about how the media focuses a lot on post-apocalyptic events, zombie outbreaks, nuclear war, geological catastrophes. The idea of the world ending is more rooted in how the world that we know would end, and not the literal destruction of the planet. This shift has come about as the world no longer sees itself as the center of the universe, and we understand that while we may not exist, the cosmic landscape would not miss us. But let's switch gears and talk about how this relates to Halo. It is quite clear how each faction represents one of the horsemen of the apocalypse, the bringers of the end times. The Covenant represents war. The Flood most obviously represents pestilence, or often changed to conquest. And while some may say the Covenant more likely represents conquest, we will discuss how even this interpretation means the Flood is still a better fit. The Forerunners and their galaxy-wiping technology are famine. And the Master Chief? Well, he is the embodiment of death. More indirectly, humanity being death. The Covenant, while they certainly represent the concept of war, most notably in the Human Covenant War, it is not the only way war is presented to us through the Covenant. The basis of the Covenant is the Great Journey. I have a full video on the Great Journey if you want to understand the entire concept. In layman's, the Great Journey is the idea that the Forerunners, the godlike beings that they were, rose to another level of existence, a plane of immortality, and the Covenant are seeking this immortality. The entire Covenant is built on the idea of reaching godhood. Like the Bible, the idea of living a good life and living it well, with the promise and reward at the end of being eternal happiness. This is essentially the exact same concept for the Great Journey, heaven, in other words. Though the Covenant created this path for themselves, to follow in the footsteps of the Forerunners, the path to godhood, there's only one thing that is certain to them. The path to salvation and immortality is through war. In our current world, we have seen many nations go to war before they become allies. This seems to be the repetitive pattern for the Halo universe as well. The Covenant started from a war between the prophets and the elites, while it also managed to get stronger through warring against other races. Every single race that makes up the Covenant has been at war with the Covenant at first, only to be whittled down into submission. One thing we mustn't forget is the concept of war in the biblical sense. The four horsemen of the apocalypse are the tangible representation of the end times. In the book of Revelations, the idea of the end times begins with the opening of 7 seals. These seals would be opened or broken by the Son of God, or as we know it to be, Jesus. The first 4 seals are unleashed by Jesus to signify the beginning of the end, and thus come forth the horsemen. In this context, the Covenant signified the end of end times through their crusade against humanity. Their intention to wage war, conquer, and extinguish humanity brings about the end times for the human species in Halo. Though the Halo universe survives, it is only through the mercy of the Forerunners. The war that is waged upon humanity nearly indeed caused the end of humanity. But much like in the Bible, no one seal signifies the absolute end. The seal of war is merely only a part to a whole. But the Covenant display the telltale signs of their mastery of this aspect superfluously. As I mentioned earlier, every single species that became part of their holy union was introduced to them through war. The Covenant have no ability to create, only destroy. All their technology comes from their gods, a facsimile or an attempt to imitate the Forerunners. Every species in the Covenant reaches this level of power and excellency by mere imitation, and when they are threatened, their immediate recourse is war. Humanity in Halo, however, seems to be the only species that achieved every monument on their own merit. Though eventually they begin to imitate the Forerunners by using their technology left behind, it only serves to show the dichotomy of the two groups. The Covenant's way of life is war. No one species in the Covenant knows how to survive in every aspect of life. Not all of them can farm, build ships, colonize planets, or educate the feeble-minded. But one thing they all share in common is that they are all fighters and wagers of war. The prophets led the war by ordering the beginning of a new conflict. The elites led troops into battle. The brutes eventually replaced the elites in this endeavor, but from the moment they joined until the very end, they are combatants by nature. The grunts, drones, jackals, and hunters are also only instruments in the war. Each species is nothing more than a cog in the war machine. Though the Covenant ultimately lose, this is a bigger homage to the idea of the apocalypse. These may not have been the end times, but the Covenant represents only one of the first 4 seals to be broken. Had all aspects of the 7 seals been released, it most certainly would have been the end time for the galaxy. The galaxy of Halo is safe in the Covenant, but once a new Covenant is formed, the immediate thought and priority is to wage war once more. Even the concept of the banished stems from this. They were once part of the Covenant, and yet they now wage war again. It is the same cruel joke, only by a different punchline. War poisoned everything it touched, hence why everything the Covenant touches becomes deranged and war-driven. Pestilence, or sometimes known as conquest. I don't believe anything embodies the idea of pestilence more than the Flood. They corrupt and swallow everything, turn it into a grotesque joke, a shadow of its former self, one with teeth and claws. From the beginning of the Flood until its eradication and resurgence, they herald the end of times by bringing plague, sickness, and a pandemic throughout the galaxy. The main goal of the Flood is to spread from host to host, from planet to planet, spreading the sickness that takes root within and burrows itself so deep it has nowhere to go but back out. The Flood is an all-consuming, shapeless evil that brings a nauseating disease to all. During the reformation from the remains of the precursors, they would spread to every available host to consume it with an unstoppable disease. An insatiable hunger. The spread of the Flood sickness is several orders of magnitude larger than any plague, pandemic, epidemic. It is a cancer on the fabric of the universe itself. It manifests in every imaginable aspect of galactic order. At the height of their power, the Flood were infecting and sickening the universe itself. While the plague was contained to the Milky Way galaxy, as far as we know anyway, it began to affect the core concepts of existence and what it means to be real. The bilious infestation on the galaxy corrupted slip space, a dimension that intersects with the real fabric of space-time. Whether it infected slip space or space-time first, it's unknown, but both were a twisted form of their former selves. Traveling around the galaxy was no longer safe during the Forerunner Flood War, as the Flood was reshaping space itself to its will in order to entrap those non-infected. It began to infect time and the electromagnetic spectrum as well, forcing victims that could not be infected to live out an eternity in seconds in order to break them, scrambling signals of survivors requesting for help, corrupting everything and nothingness. Even the concepts such as neurophysics were being turned against the galaxy itself with the mere existence of so much Flood. What heralds the end of the world more clearly than a parasite that consumes all individuality to transform it into a mucus-like membrane that functions as the tapestry in which a twisted reality is woven? Nothing. Only the Flood can achieve such a signal of the end times. Nothing else can be compared to this pestilence. And if you want to take the route of conquest, they literally went from planet to planet, conquering anything living and dead through their infection. Whether it was simple life forms or the demigod Forerunners, they conquered it. The Forerunners were forced to turn into the embodiment of famine because of this. Once a proud race who saw themselves as the protectors of all life in the galaxy and seeders of the garden left behind by their makers, only to be forced into exterminators. Starvation and devastation. The Forerunners struggled with the Flood for countless years, the war that would end all wars one way or another. It was the closest thing to Armageddon the galaxy had seen at that point. They made the decision to wipe out all life from the galaxy in order to stop the Flood. But in a sense, they were only creating a famine for the universe. As the principles of neurophysics states, the universe itself is a living organism with thought and emotion. The very life that exists within the universe is the platter of nutrients that feeds its existence. While the physical space the universe takes up was the body, the individuals with thoughts and feelings inside were the progenitors of its existence. The Forerunners starved out not only the Flood by creating and firing the Halo Array, but also the galaxy and universe as a whole, creating a famine so the Flood could be extinguished, and another which would cripple the very essence of life itself, of creation. There is nothing more biblical than man's folly of comparing himself to God and trying to control and dictate the actions of the living. In both instances, the Forerunners attempted to play God and failed themselves. Their creators and the universe as a whole. Though once more, this was not the end of existence, but this can only truly be said because the Forerunners only brought famine to this galaxy. Though bringing an end to a large portion of the universe's creation, they were merely a part to a near end of existence, once again earning the label of a horseman. As a race, the word Forerunner could be considered nothing more than famine. This ultimately brings us to the personification of death, whether it's humanity as a whole, or more precisely, Sierra 117, aka John, aka the Master Chief, is at the center of all horsemen. What does war, pestilence, conquest, and famine all have in common? They bring death. Who else brings death? This man. In all of Halo, who are we most sure of has brought death? Chief, on a galactic level. Chief manifests everything that brings the end of times. As human, he is part of the race that has been in the most versatile conflicts of all time, whether it be against the Covenant, the Forerunners, or the Flood, or even against itself. Humanity can't keep a hand out of the proverbial cookie jar of death. He has single-handedly brought death to thousands if not millions of individuals of all races. From humans to insurgents to Promethean Knights, back to every race of Covenant warriors, down to the infected versions of each one of the above. Master Chief was present for the release of the Seals of the Apocalypse in every instance. He witnessed the beginning of the Human Covenant War. He has seen the beginning of the second Human Forerunner conflict by awakening and killing the Didact. He has brought death to insurgents, and being a human did not stop him from ending their existence. He was there when the Flood was once again re-released into the galaxy, yet another one of the Seals. His mere presence heralds conflict that teeters on the edge of creating a new extinction to this galaxy. He may not be the culprit, but because of his involvement in these conflicts, he inadvertently pushes his foes into further extremes that push the entire galaxy ever closer to its final judgment. But ultimately, he can also be seen as the Christ figure of the Halo universe. We have been told for over 2 decades that the Master Chief is the savior of the human race, not just from the conflict with the Covenant, or stopping the Flood, or gaining the trust of the Arbiter and ushering in a new peace previously unthinkable, but also as a role model to all of humanity, to all of what humanity should and could become. The Halo universe owes the Master Chief 2 debts. 1 for pushing them closer to the brink of Armageddon, and 2 for bringing them off the ledge from the chasm. Ultimately, his story will be that of sacrifice. Master Chief himself has acknowledged that he will never retire, that he knows he will die on the battlefield. He has known it his whole life. He will die for the sins of humanity, and with his death, the human race will see its darkest hour, but they will rise from it and become better for it. This has already happened after all. Humanity faced near extinction at the end of Halo 3, with Earth nearly eradicated as well as nearly every colony. His death marked a new beginning, where humanity would begin to reclaim its place. But beyond that, all species faced a hardship. The Covenant breaking apart and having to relearn how to exist without codependence, and humanity learning to rebuild, but ultimately beginning the cycle anew. A cycle that starts and ends with the apocalyptic seals opening and closing. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves, Reclaimers.